Jake Morrison rubbed his tired eyes as the cargo hauler finally docked at Nexus Station. The past 3 weeks had been nothing but jump after jump through hyperspace, delivering medical supplies to the outer rim colonies where decent health care was just a dream. His back ached from sleeping in the cramped pilot seat, and his stomach growled loud enough to wake the dead. The first thing he needed was a hot meal and something stronger than the recycled water his ship had been serving him. Nexus Station buzzed with activity as always. The massive trading hub sat right on the edge of known space, where dozens of alien species came to do business away from the watchful eyes of their respective governments. Jake had been here maybe a dozen times over the past 2 years, ever since humanity joined the galactic community. It still amazed him to see so many different life forms in one place. He walked through the main corridor, passing tall blue-skinned Zilithians with their elegant robes, short stocky Kryn with their rock-like hide, and the mysterious void runners who never showed their faces behind those dark masks. Everyone seemed to have somewhere important to go, carrying cargo containers or data tablets or strange devices that hummed with alien technology. Murphy's Cantina sat tucked away in a quieter section of the station. The owner was actually a human named Pat Murphy, who had set up shop here about 5 years ago, back when humans were still trying to figure out their place in the galaxy. The place served decent food and drinks from a dozen different worlds, and Pat never asked too many questions about where his customers came from or what they were hauling. Jake pushed through the heavy doors and felt the familiar weight of the cantina's atmosphere. The lighting was dim and warm, nothing like the harsh white lights of the station corridors. A mix of alien music played softly in the background, something with too many drums and not enough melody for human ears. The air smelled like a combination of exotic spices and cleaning fluid. About 20 different beings filled the tables scattered around the room. Jake recognized most of the species by now, though he couldn't pronounce half their names correctly. A group of Zilithian traders sat near the window, their long fingers dancing over holographic displays as they argued about shipping rates. Some Kryn merchants occupied the big round table in the center, their gravelly voices discussing mining rights on some distant asteroid field. Jake made his way to his usual spot, a small corner table where he could keep his back to the wall and watch the room. Old habits from his days working security back on Earth, before he decided to try his luck hauling cargo through space. Pat Murphy himself stood behind the bar, a big man with graying hair and arms like tree trunks, polishing glasses with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. "The usual, Jake?" Pat called out, already reaching for the bottle of real Earth whiskey he kept special for human customers. The stuff cost 3 times what the synthetic alcohol did, but after weeks of eating nothing but protein bars and vitamin paste, Jake figured he deserved something that reminded him of home. "Make it a double," Jake replied, settling into his chair with a grunt of relief. The synthetic leather creaked under his weight, and he noticed someone had carved initials into the table since his last visit. Probably some lovesick trader marking his territory before heading back to whatever rock he came from. Pat brought the drink over personally, setting it down with the reverence the good whiskey deserved. "Long haul?" he asked, though the answer was written all over Jake's face. 3 weeks in space tended to leave a person looking like they'd been dragged through a black hole backwards. "Outer rim medical run," Jake said, taking his first sip and feeling the warm burn spread through his chest. "Nothing but emergency supplies and medicine to colonies that can barely afford to keep the lights on." "Good work, though." "People need help, you know." Pat nodded with understanding. Most of the independent haulers who stopped at his place were decent folk, just trying to make an honest living in a galaxy that seemed to get more complicated every day. "Well, you take your time. Kitchen's got that Terran beef stew you like, if you're interested." Jake's stomach answered before he could, growling loud enough that a nearby void runner actually turned to look in his direction. "Sounds perfect, and Pat, thanks for keeping the good stuff in stock. Most places out here you ask for whiskey and they give you something that tastes like engine coolant." The cantina door opened with its usual heavy thud, but this time the conversations around the room went quiet. Jake didn't need to look to know something was wrong. 20 years of dealing with trouble had taught him to recognize the feeling in the air when dangerous people walked into a room. He took another sip of his whiskey and casually glanced toward the entrance. 6 figures stood in the doorway, and Jake's heart sank a little when he recognized what they were. Horthak warriors, each one standing nearly 7 feet tall with 4 powerful arms and skin like gray leather. Their species had a reputation throughout the galaxy as mercenaries and pirates, the kind of beings other species hired when they needed someone hurt and didn't care about the details. The lead Korthak had scars running down the left side of his face and wore the kind of armor that said he'd survived more fights than most people had nightmares. His 3 companions spread out behind him, moving with the casual confidence of predators who knew they were the most dangerous things in the room. Jake kept his eyes on his drink, hoping they'd find a table and mind their own business. He'd had enough excitement for 1 month, and picking a fight with Korthak mercenaries wasn't on his list of things to do before dinner. Unfortunately, the galaxy rarely cared what Jake Morrison wanted to do with his evening. The lead Korthak's eyes swept the room like a scanner, taking in every detail and every face. When his gaze fell on Jake, it stopped and held. Jake could feel the weight of that stare, measuring him the way a butcher measures meat. He'd been in enough bad situations to know when someone was sizing him up for trouble. "Human," the Korthak said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience. The universal translator built into the station's systems turned his words into perfect English, but it couldn't hide the menace behind them. "You sit in warrior seat." Jake looked up slowly, meeting the alien's 4 eyes with as much calm as he could manage. "I'm just having a drink, friend. There are plenty of empty tables if you need somewhere to sit." The Korthak's scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile on a friendlier species. "Human calls Vextar friend, amusing. You move now, buy drinks for Korthak warriors. Show proper respect to superiors." Every conversation in the cantina had stopped completely now. The Zalithian traders had gone very still, their blue faces pale with worry. Even the Void Runners had turned to watch, though their masks made it impossible to read their expressions. Pat Murphy stood behind the bar with his hand resting near something Jake couldn't see, but hoped was more substantial than a bar towel. Jake took another slow sip of his whiskey, buying time to think. He could give up his table, buy the drinks, and probably walk away from this without any broken bones. It would cost him maybe 50 credits and a little pride, small prices to pay for avoiding a fight with 4-armed killing machines. But something in the way Vextar said superiors made Jake's jaw clench. He'd spent 2 years watching humans try to find their place in the galactic community, always being treated like the new kids who had to prove themselves worthy of sitting at the grown-up table. Most of the time, he could swallow his pride and play along with the politics. Tonight was not most of the time. Jake set his whiskey glass down with deliberate care, the soft clink against the table somehow louder than all the machinery humming through the station. He could feel every pair of eyes in the cantina watching him, waiting to see if the human would fold like most species did when the Korthak made their demands. The silence stretched out like a held breath, thick with tension and the promise of violence. Vextar took a step closer, his 4 arms flexing in a way that made his muscles ripple beneath the gray skin. The other Korthak warriors spread out behind him, moving with practiced ease to block the exits. They'd done this dance before, Jake realized. Probably dozens of times across dozens of worlds, always finding someone smaller and weaker to push around. "Human not answer Vextar," the lead warrior growled, his scarred face twisting into something uglier than his usual expression. "Maybe human not understand. Korthak warriors take what they want. Weak species give respect or learn pain." Jake stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the metal floor with a sound like fingernails on steel. He wasn't a particularly big man by human standards, maybe 6 feet tall, with the kind of wiry build that came from years of hauling cargo and fixing broken equipment. Next to the massive Korthak, he looked like a child standing next to giants. "I heard you just fine," Jake said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline starting to pump through his system. "And I already gave you my answer. There are empty tables over there if you want to sit down. I'm not moving and I'm not buying you anything." A ripple of shock went through the cantina. The Zalithian traders actually gasped, a sound like wind through crystal chimes. One of the Kryn merchants muttered something in his own language that the translator didn't bother to convert, probably because it was too profane for polite company. Even the mysterious Void Runners leaned forward in their seats as if they couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. Vextar's 4 eyes went wide with surprise, then narrowed with rage. In all his years of terrorizing the trading lanes, no single being had ever refused him twice. Certainly not some soft-skinned mammal from a species that had barely crawled out of their own solar system. Human makes mistake. Vextar snarled, all four of his arms spreading wide in a threat display that would have sent most creatures running for the nearest exit. Korthak warriors crush bones of stupid animals who forget their place. We take your ship, sell your cargo, leave your body floating in space for scavengers. Jake rolled his shoulders, working out the kinks from 3 weeks of sleeping in cramped quarters. He'd been in enough fights to know the signs when talking was over, and violence was about to begin. The smart thing would be to back down, pay whatever tribute they wanted, and live to haul cargo another day. But Jake Morrison had never been particularly smart when it came to bullies. You know what your problem is? Jake asked, reaching into his jacket pocket. Half the room tensed, expecting him to draw a weapon, but he only pulled out a small device that looked like a combination tool and scanner. You've been picking on species that roll over when you show your teeth. Makes you think you're tougher than you really are. The device beeped softly as Jake activated it, and suddenly every being in the cantina could hear his voice clearly, no matter what language they spoke. It was a universal communicator, standard equipment for any hauler who worked the outer rim, where dozens of languages mixed together in the same space. Let me tell you something about humans, Jake continued, his amplified voice carrying to every corner of the room. We didn't claw our way to the top of the food chain on Earth by backing down from bigger predators. We did it by being meaner, smarter, and more stubborn than anything else on the planet. Vexitar had heard enough speeches. With a roar that shook the glasses behind the bar, he lunged forward with all four arms reaching for Jake's throat. The Korthak was fast, faster than most beings his size had any right to be, and his claws could tear through metal plating without much effort. Jake was faster. He ducked under the reaching arms and came up inside Vextar's guard, his right fist driving upward into the soft spot just below the Korthak's ribcage. The blow landed with a sound like a hammer hitting meat, and Vextar doubled over with a wheeze of pain and surprise. The other 5 Korthak warriors moved instantly, converging on Jake from all sides. They'd expected their leader to end the fight with one swing, and seeing him hurt sent them into a rage that made rational thought impossible. Claws and fists filled the air around Jake as they attacked without coordination, each one trying to be the first to draw human blood. Jake grabbed the first warrior's extended arm and used the alien's own momentum to spin him into the path of his companion's charge. The 2 Korthak crashed into each other with bone-jarring force, their heavy bodies tangling together as they went down in a heap of limbs and angry cursing. The third warrior tried to grab Jake from behind, but the human had already moved, rolling across a nearby table and sending drinks and food flying in all directions. The Korthak's claws raked empty air where Jake had been standing a second before, leaving deep gouges in the synthetic wood. Too slow, Jake called out, jumping back to his feet on the other side of the table. You boys fight like you're wearing gravity boots. The insult sent the remaining Korthak into an even greater fury. They charged again, but this time Jake was ready for them. He grabbed a heavy bottle from the scattered drinks and hurled it at the nearest warrior's head. The bottle shattered against the alien's skull, sending sticky blue liquid splashing across his face and into his eyes. Blinded and enraged, the Korthak swung wildly at where he thought Jake might be, but only succeeded in smashing a chair into splinters and putting his fist through the wall. The impact sent vibrations through the station's hull, and somewhere in the distance an alarm began to wail. Jake used the confusion to his advantage, moving constantly and never staying in one place long enough for the larger aliens to pin him down. He grabbed another bottle, this one filled with something that glowed green and smelled like sulfur, and threw it at the feet of 2 advancing warriors. The bottle burst on impact, and whatever chemical was inside began eating through the metal floor with a hissing sound that made everyone in the cantina take a step back. The 2 Korthak found themselves standing on a surface that was rapidly dissolving beneath their feet, and their attempts to move only made them slip and slide in the expanding puddle of acid. By now, Vextar had recovered from Jake's initial punch, though he was still moving more carefully than before. The human had hurt him, actually hurt him, and that was supposed to be impossible. Humans were supposed to be weak, soft creatures who relied on technology instead of their own strength. You fight like coward, Vextar spat, wiping blood from his mouth with the back of one massive hand. Hide behind furniture, throw bottles like child. Face Vextar in honest combat. Jake picked up a bent piece of metal that had once been part of a chair and tested its weight in his hand. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than fighting 4-armed monsters with nothing but his fists. Honest combat? Jake laughed, a sound with no humor in it. You brought 5 friends to beat up one guy having a quiet drink. Don't talk to me about honest anything. The cantina had turned into a war zone. Tables lay overturned, chairs were scattered in pieces across the floor, and every surface was covered with spilled drinks, broken glass, and alien blood. The other patrons had pressed themselves against the walls, trying to stay out of the way of the violence, while still being close enough to witness what might be the first time anyone had ever fought back against Korthak intimidation. Pat Murphy stood behind his bar with a shotgun in his hands, but he made no move to intervene. This was Jake's fight, and the barkeeper knew better than to get between a human and his enemies when the violence had already started. The 5 remaining Korthak began to circle Jake again, but more cautiously this time. They'd learned that the human wasn't going to stand still and let them tear him apart, and their initial rage was giving way to something that might have been respect, if it hadn't been mixed with so much hatred. Jake spun the piece of metal in his hand and smiled, showing his teeth in a way that reminded everyone in the room that humans were descended from predators. "Come on then," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of alarms and settling debris. "Let's see what you got." The 5 Korthak warriors moved like a pack of predators, each one trying to find an opening while Jake kept spinning in the center of their circle. They'd learned from their first mistake and weren't rushing in blindly anymore, but they still didn't understand what they were really fighting against. To them, Jake was just another soft alien, who happened to be luckier and faster than most. They had no idea that humans had spent millions of years learning how to kill things, bigger and stronger than themselves. The first warrior made his move, lunging forward with 2 arms reaching high and 2 reaching low, trying to grab Jake no matter which way he dodged. Jake didn't dodge at all. Instead, he stepped into the attack, bringing the bent metal bar up in a sharp arc that caught the Korthak's lower right arm just above the elbow joint. The sound of breaking bone echoed through the cantina, followed immediately by a howl of pain that made the station's hull vibrate. The warrior stumbled backward, his useless arm hanging at an impossible angle while he clutched at the injury with his remaining hands. "One down," Jake said, already moving to avoid the next attack. The wounded Korthak was out of the fight, maybe permanently, but that still left 4 healthy ones plus Vextar himself. 2 more warriors came at him from different sides, thinking they could overwhelm him with coordinated attacks. Jake grabbed the edge of an overturned table and swung it like a shield, catching the first attacker across the face with enough force to send him sprawling. The second warrior's claws scraped along the table's surface, leaving deep grooves but failing to reach their target. Jake spun the table around and slammed it into the second warrior's knees. The heavy furniture connected with a crack that made everyone in the room wince, and the Korthak went down hard, his legs no longer able to support his massive weight. "2 down," Jake announced, breathing harder now but still moving with deadly purpose. Sweat ran down his face and mixed with blood from a dozen small cuts where Korthak claws had come too close, but his eyes remained focused and alert. The remaining warriors were starting to realize they might have made a serious mistake. In their culture, strength was everything, and the strong took whatever they wanted from the weak. But this human wasn't weak, not in any way that mattered. He fought like something wild and desperate, using every dirty trick and underhanded tactic their warrior code despised. More importantly, he wasn't getting tired the way he should be. Korthak physiology was built for quick, overwhelming attacks that ended fights in seconds or minutes. Their muscle fibers could generate incredible force, but they burned through energy fast and needed time to recover between bursts of activity. Most species they fought either died quickly or surrendered once they realized how outmatched they were. Humans, it seemed, were built differently. Jake had been fighting for several minutes now, long enough that any normal opponent should be exhausted and ready to collapse. Instead, he seemed to be getting more dangerous as the fight went on, as if the violence was waking something up inside him that had been sleeping. The third warrior tried a different approach, grabbing a broken chair leg and swinging it like a club. The improvised weapon whistled through the air toward Jake's head with enough force to crack his skull like an egg. But Jake ducked under the swing and came up inside the alien's guard again. This time, instead of throwing a punch, Jake grabbed the warrior's wrist and twisted hard. The Korthak's own strength worked against him as Jake used leverage and momentum to flip the much larger being over his shoulder and slam him into the floor with bone-jarring force. The warrior hit the ground so hard that the metal deck plates actually bent under the impact. He tried to get back up, but his legs wouldn't obey him anymore, and he could only lie there gasping for breath while his vision swam with pain and confusion. 3 down, Jake said, and now there was something in his voice that made even Vextar take a step backward. It was the sound of a predator that had tasted blood and found it good. The 4th warrior was the smartest of the group, or maybe just the most cowardly. He looked around at his fallen comrades, looked at the human who was still standing and still smiling that terrible smile, and made a decision that would have gotten him exiled from Korthak society if anyone had been left alive to report it. He ran. The warrior turned and bolted for the cantina's exit, pushing past startled patrons and knocking over furniture in his desperate need to be anywhere else. Jake watched him go with something that might have been amusement, making no attempt to pursue the fleeing alien. "Smart boy," Jake murmured, then turned his attention to the last warrior standing beside Vextar himself. This one was younger than the others, probably on his first tour as a mercenary, and Jake could see the fear in his 4 eyes. The young Korthak looked at his leader, then at the human, then at his 3 unconscious companions scattered around the ruined cantina. "I yield," he said in accented standard, the words coming out strangled with shame and terror. "Human warrior defeats Korthak." "I yield." Jake nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement between fighters. "Smart choice, kid. Go help your friends." The young warrior immediately dropped to his knees beside the most badly injured of his companions, checking for broken bones and serious wounds. His hands shook as he worked, whether from fear or shame or both, but he was clearly no longer a threat to anyone. That left only Vextar, the scarred leader who had started this whole mess by demanding tribute from a tired human who just wanted to drink his whiskey in peace. The cantina fell silent, except for the distant sound of alarms and the groaning of injured Korthak warriors. Every being in the room watched as the 2 fighters faced each other across the wreckage of what had once been a peaceful bar. Vextar was breathing heavily, his forearms hanging loose at his sides. He'd been in hundreds of fights during his career as a mercenary, had killed beings from dozens of different species, but he'd never seen anything like what this human had just done to his crew. "You fight well for soft mammal," Vextar admitted, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. "But Vextar is not like others. Vextar is war leader trained from birth to kill. You defeat weak soldiers, but now you face true warrior." Jake picked up a new weapon from the debris around his feet, a piece of metal that had once been part of a table leg. It was heavier than the first one, with a jagged end that would punch through armor or hide with equal ease. "You know what I think?" Jake asked, settling into a fighting stance that looked deceptively relaxed. "I think you're scared. I think you've spent so long bullying people who couldn't fight back that you forgot what real danger feels like." Vextar roared in rage and charged, all 4 arms extended and claws gleaming in the cantina's dim lighting. He was fast, incredibly fast, and his attack came with the full weight of his massive body behind it. Jake was ready for him. Instead of trying to dodge or block the charge, Jake did something that went against every instinct of self-preservation. He ran straight at Vextar, meeting the alien's charge head-on with his improvised weapon held like a spear. The 2 fighters collided in the center of the ruined cantina, with a sound like a freight train hitting a wall. For a moment, everything was chaos and motion and the spray of alien blood across broken furniture. Then the dust settled, and only one figure was left standing. Jake Morrison stood over the unconscious form of Vextar, the former war leader laid out flat on his back with his scarred face peaceful in defeat. Blood ran from a dozen wounds on both fighters, but Jake was still on his feet while the mighty Korthak warrior wasn't moving at all. The cantina erupted in shocked voices as beings who had witnessed the impossible tried to process what they'd just seen. A single human, armed with nothing but improvised weapons and pure determination, had defeated 6 trained Korthak warriors in single combat. Jake dropped his makeshift weapon and walked slowly back to his table, where his whiskey glass sat exactly where he'd left it. The glass was cracked now, probably from the vibrations of the fight, but the whiskey inside was still good. He raised the glass in a mock toast to the unconscious Korthak scattered around the floor. "Should have just found another table," he said, and drained the whiskey in one long swallow. The silence in Murphy's cantina lasted exactly 13 seconds before chaos erupted. Every being in the room started talking at once, their voices mixing into a babble of different languages that the station's translation system struggled to keep up with. The Zilithian traders were arguing among themselves about what they'd witnessed, their musical voices rising to near-panic levels. The Kryn merchants sat in stunned silence, their rocky faces showing more emotion than anyone had ever seen from their species. Pat Murphy emerged from behind his destroyed bar, stepping carefully around broken glass and unconscious Korthak warriors. His shotgun was still in his hands, but he held it loosely now, more out of habit than any real need. The fight was over, and everyone in the room knew it. "Jake," Pat said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "In 30 years of running bars across 3 different star systems, I have never seen anything like that." Jake winced as he tried to straighten his shirt, feeling the pull of cuts and bruises that were just starting to make themselves known. The adrenaline was wearing off, and his body was sending him a detailed report of every place Korthak claws had found their mark. He was going to hurt like hell tomorrow, assuming he lived that long. "Just wanted to finish my drink in peace," Jake muttered, looking around at the wreckage that had once been a decent cantina. Tables lay scattered in pieces, chairs were reduced to splinters, and there were claw marks gouged deep into the walls and floor. The place looked like a tornado had hit it, if tornadoes were 7 feet tall and had 4 arms each. One of the Zilithian traders approached cautiously, his blue skin pale with shock. "Human warrior," he said, his translator rendering his musical speech into heavily accented standard. "We must send word to our ships. The galaxy must know what has happened here." "What's to know?" Jake asked, though he was starting to get a sinking feeling in his stomach. "Some bullies picked the wrong person to mess with. Happens every day." The Zilithian's 4 eyes went wide with surprise. "Happens every day? Human, you have just accomplished something that was thought impossible. 6 Korthak warriors defeated by a single being. The mercenary guilds will want to study recordings of this fight for decades." As if summoned by those words, small floating devices began emerging from hidden compartments around the cantina. Security drones, Jake realized, equipped with cameras and sensors that had been recording everything from multiple angles. Standard equipment for any establishment that served alcohol to armed beings from dozens of different species. "Oh hell," Jake said, watching the drones buzz around the room like mechanical vultures. "Those things were recording?" Pat Murphy nodded grimly. "Station regulations. Anytime there's a fight involving potential injury or property damage, the security system automatically activates. The footage gets stored in the main computer and sent to station security within minutes." Jake rubbed his face with both hands, trying to think through the implications. He'd just wanted to deliver his medical supplies, grab a meal and a drink, maybe get a decent night's sleep in a real bed for once. Now he was looking at becoming some kind of galactic celebrity, which was about the last thing any independent cargo hauler needed. "How long before this gets out?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Too late," said one of the Void Runners, speaking for the first time since Jake had entered the cantina. His voice was electronically modified by his mask, giving it an eerie quality that made everyone in the room pay attention. "Signal already transmitted to news networks. Bounty hunters will know within hours. Mercenary guilds will know by morning." The young Korthak warrior who had yielded looked up from where he was tending to his unconscious companions. "Human warrior," he said, his voice thick with shame and something that might have been respect. "What you have done here will echo through the stars. No Korthak will be able to ignore this defeat. My clan will demand blood price for the dishonor." Jake felt his headache getting worse. "Blood price? What the hell is a blood price?" "Traditional challenge," the young alien explained, carefully checking Vextar's pulse to make sure his leader was still alive. "When Korthak warriors are defeated in combat, the clan must restore honor. They will send their best fighters to challenge you one by one until either you are dead or they accept you as superior warrior." "That's just great," Jake muttered. "So now I've got an entire alien warrior culture wanting to take turns trying to kill me. This day just keeps getting better." The cantina doors burst open again, but this time it was station security flooding in. A dozen armored figures carrying energy weapons spread out through the room, their helmet lights cutting through the dim atmosphere. The lead officer, a tall humanoid with green skin and too many joints in his arms, surveyed the wreckage with the weary expression of someone who dealt with bar fights on a regular basis. "All right, everybody stay calm," the officer announced, his voice amplified by his suit's speakers. "I'm Captain Rex of Station Security. We received reports of a disturbance involving multiple casualties and significant property damage. I need everyone to remain where they are while we sort this out." Captain Rex's eyes fell on the unconscious Korthak warriors scattered around the room, then moved to Jake, who was standing in the middle of the destruction looking like he'd been through a meat grinder. The security officer had seen enough fight scenes to recognize the winner and loser when he saw them. "Let me guess," Rex said with a sigh. "The Korthak started it and the human finished it." "Something like that," Pat Murphy confirmed, stepping forward with his hands clearly visible and empty. Jake here was just trying to drink his whiskey when Vextar and his crew decided to shake him down for tribute money. Jake declined their generous offer. Captain Rex activated a recording device built into his armor and began documenting the scene. His scanner swept over each unconscious Korthak, cataloging their injuries and estimated recovery times. When he got to Vextar, the device beeped in a way that suggested surprise. "Interesting," Rex muttered, studying his readings. "Severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, dislocated shoulder, and what appears to be a completely shattered sense of superiority. He'll live, but his fighting days are probably over." Jake sat down heavily in the least damaged chair he could find, suddenly feeling every year of his age and every mile he'd traveled in the past month. "Look, Captain, I just want to pay for my drinks and get out of here. I've got cargo to deliver and a schedule to keep." Captain Rex looked at him like he'd suggested flying into a black hole for fun. "Mr. Morrison, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. This fight is going to be front-page news on every major world within 48 hours. The Galactic News Network is probably already preparing special reports about the human who defeated 6 Korthak single-handedly." As if to prove his point, Rex's communication device started buzzing with incoming messages. He glanced at the display and his green face went a shade paler. "We've got news ships requesting docking permission," he reported. 3 different mercenary guilds want to interview the participants. The Korthak High Command is demanding an official investigation. And he paused, reading another message with growing disbelief. "The Galactic Council wants a full report on human combat capabilities." Jake put his head in his hands and groaned. "I just wanted to drink my whiskey." Meanwhile, word of the fight was already spreading through the vast network of communication relays that connected the galaxy's civilized worlds. On trading ships and military vessels, in government offices and mercenary hiring halls, beings throughout known space were learning about the impossible thing that had happened at a small cantina on the edge of nowhere. The human species, which most of the galaxy had dismissed as clever but physically weak newcomers, had just announced their presence in the most dramatic way possible. One of their own had faced down 6 trained Korthak warriors and emerged victorious, using nothing but improvised weapons and determination. For some species, this news was cause for celebration. The Korthak had been terrorizing the trading lanes for decades, and seeing them defeated was a victory for everyone who valued peace and honest commerce. For others, particularly those who made their living through intimidation and violence, Jake Morrison's victory represented something far more troubling. If humans could fight like this, if they possessed capabilities that had been completely hidden until now, then perhaps it was time to reevaluate humanity's place in the galactic hierarchy. In the cantina, Jake was beginning to realize that his life had just changed forever, whether he wanted it to or not. The quiet anonymity of an independent cargo hauler was gone, replaced by a reputation that would follow him to every world and every port in known space. The age of human insignificance was over, and it had ended with a bar fight that nobody would ever forget. 6 months later, Jake Morrison sat in the same corner booth at Murphy's Cantina, nursing the same brand of whiskey he'd been drinking the night everything changed. The cantina looked completely different now, rebuilt and expanded to handle the steady stream of visitors who came specifically to see where the famous fight had taken place. Pat Murphy had installed reinforced furniture, better lighting, and a small memorial plaque that read, "The Murphy Incident, where humanity announced itself to the galaxy." Jake hated that plaque with every fiber of his being. The cantina was busier than it had ever been, filled with beings from dozens of species who all wanted to catch a glimpse of the human who had defeated 6 Korthak warriors in single combat. Most of them kept their distance, content to stare and whisper among themselves. But a few brave souls occasionally approached his table with requests for autographs or stories about the fight. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, the cantina was hosting a delegation from the Galactic Defense Coalition, and their leader was a stern-faced woman in a crisp military uniform who had been trying to recruit Jake for the past 3 hours. "Mr. Morrison," Admiral Lisa Parker said, for what felt like the 100th time, "you have to understand the position you've put us in. The entire galaxy is talking about human combat capabilities. Half the species out there want to hire human mercenaries, and the other half are wondering if they need to start preparing for a human invasion." Jake took another sip of his whiskey and wished he was back on his cargo hauler, delivering medical supplies to colonies that couldn't afford decent health care. Life had been simpler when nobody knew his name or cared what he could do in a fight. "Admiral," he said patiently, "I've told you before and I'll tell you again. I'm not a soldier. I'm not a mercenary. I'm just a guy who hauls cargo from one place to another and occasionally has to deal with bullies who don't understand the word no." The fight at Murphy's had indeed changed everything, just as Captain Rex had predicted. Within days of the security footage hitting the galactic news networks, Jake had found himself famous throughout known space. The video of him systematically dismantling 6 trained Korthak warriors had been watched billions of times across hundreds of worlds. More importantly, it had fundamentally altered how other species viewed humanity. Before the Murphy incident, humans were seen as clever but physically weak newcomers who relied on technology to compensate for their biological limitations. They were merchants and diplomats, engineers and scientists, but certainly not warriors. Jake Morrison had shattered that perception with his bare hands and a piece of broken furniture. The Korthak High Command had indeed demanded blood satisfaction, sending their finest warriors to challenge Jake in honorable combat. The first challenger had lasted exactly 47 seconds before Jake put him through the cantina's reinforced wall. The second had managed almost 2 minutes before, succumbing to a sleeper hold that left him unconscious but unharmed. After the 5th Korthak champion woke up in the station's medical bay with no clear memory of how he'd gotten there, the High Command had done something unprecedented in their warrior culture. They had declared Jake Morrison an honorary war chief and offered him a permanent position leading their most elite combat units. Jake had politely declined, explaining that he had medical supplies to deliver. The ripple effects had been immediate and far-reaching. Species that had been dismissing human diplomatic overtures suddenly found themselves much more willing to negotiate favorable trade agreements. Pirates and raiders who had once seen human cargo ships as easy targets began giving them a wide berth. The Zilithian Merchant Guild had offered humanity exclusive trading rights to 3-star systems in exchange for a single human security advisor. Even more surprisingly, several species had requested cultural exchanges specifically to learn about human approaches to conflict resolution. The peaceful Xylorians wanted to understand how humans could be simultaneously violent and diplomatic. The scholarly Centauri were fascinated by human tactical thinking and had offered to trade their advanced mathematics for lessons in close-quarters combat. "The thing is," Admiral Parker continued, leaning forward across the table, "we need people like you in uniform. The galaxy is a dangerous place, and now that everyone knows humans can fight, we're going to be tested constantly. Every warlord and mercenary captain from here to the galactic core is going to want to prove themselves against human warriors." Jake looked around the bustling cantina, taking in the mix of species that would have been unthinkable before his fight with the Korthak. Zilithian traders sat sharing drinks with human merchants, their previous fear replaced by genuine respect. A group of young Kryn miners had cornered a human engineer near the bar, eager to hear stories about Earth's mining techniques and apparently convinced that all humans were naturally gifted at extracting valuable minerals from hostile environments. Most amusing of all, 3 Korthak warriors sat at a table near the window, peacefully discussing shipping contracts with a pair of human traders. The largest of the 3 bore the ritual scars that marked him as one of the champions who had challenged Jake and lost, but there was no shame in his bearing anymore. Among his people, losing to Jake Morrison had become a badge of honor rather than a source of disgrace. "You know what the funny thing is?" Jake asked, finishing his whiskey and signaling Pat Murphy for another. "I'm not even that good at fighting. Back on Earth, I was just average. Maybe a little better than average because I worked security for a few years, but nothing special." Admiral Parker raised an eyebrow. "Average? Mr. Morrison, you defeated 6 trained Korthak warriors simultaneously. The statistical probability of that outcome was calculated at less than 1 in 10,000. Jake laughed, a sound with genuine humor in it for the first time in months. That's because your statisticians don't understand humans. We're not built to be the strongest or the fastest or the most naturally dangerous species in the galaxy. We're built to be the most stubborn. He gestured around the cantina, encompassing all the different species mixing together in ways that had been impossible just 6 months ago. Every one of these beings comes from a world where they were the dominant predator, or the most successful survivor. They evolved to fill a specific niche in their ecosystem, and they're really good at that one thing. Pat Murphy arrived with the fresh whiskey, setting it down with the same careful reverence he'd shown since Jake became famous. The big bartender had been offered lucrative contracts to manage establishments on a dozen different worlds, but he'd turned them all down. Murphy's Cantina was his place, and he wasn't about to abandon it just because it had become the most famous bar in the galaxy. Humans are different, Jake continued after thanking Pat with a nod. We didn't evolve to be the best at any one thing. We evolved to be good enough at everything to survive no matter what the universe threw at us. We can run long distances, climb trees, swim rivers, fight predators, solve puzzles, work together, and adapt to just about any environment you can imagine. A young alien approached the table hesitantly, and Jake recognized him as the Korthak warrior who had yielded during the original fight. The alien had been coming to the cantina regularly over the past few months, always polite and respectful, but he'd never actually spoken to Jake directly. "Human warrior Jake," the young Korthak said, his standard much improved since their first meeting. "I hope I do not interrupt important discussion." "Not at all," Jake replied, gesturing to an empty chair. "What can I do for you?" The young warrior sat down carefully, his forehands folded in what Jake had learned was a gesture of respect among his people. "I wanted to thank you for showing mercy during our fight. Among my clan, your victory has become legend. But more importantly, your honor in battle has taught us new ways of thinking about strength." Admiral Parker listened to this exchange with growing interest, and Jake could practically see the recruitment gears turning in her head. "My name is Thekmor," the young Korthak continued. "I have been studying human culture and philosophy since our encounter. I would be honored if you would accept me as student warrior, to learn your fighting ways." Jake considered this request carefully. In the months since the Murphy incident, he'd received thousands of similar requests from beings across the galaxy who wanted to learn from him. Most of them, he'd turned down politely, explaining that he wasn't a teacher and didn't have time to train students. But Thekmor was different. The young warrior had shown courage in yielding when he was outmatched, wisdom in tending to his wounded companions, and humility in accepting defeat. More than that, he'd spent months learning about human culture instead of just demanding fighting techniques. "I'm not a teacher," Jake said slowly, "but I suppose I could show you a few things about human approaches to conflict resolution. Fair warning, though, most of what we do isn't about fighting at all." Thekmor's 4 eyes lit up with excitement. "I understand, Warrior Jake. My people have learned much from studying recordings of your victory. We see now that true strength comes not from size or natural weapons, but from intelligence, adaptability, and the will to never surrender." Admiral Parker cleared her throat, reminding them both that she was still there. "Mr. Morrison, I think you're beginning to understand.